What's good, my man in society? It is your host with the most shadow log, back at you with another video. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's absolutely free. That is how you help my channel get into the algorithm. Highly appreciate you. Go ahead and do that. Now, what I wanted to talk about was somebody yesterday had, let me know that the reason I speak about these, raids and the immigration sweeps that have been happening here in California, Los Angeles, that I'm just butthurt because that they're rounding up all the cholos and they're finally going to deport all the cholos and getting them out of here, and getting all these gang members out of here, and cleaning the streets. And that's why I'm butthurt, you know because they're taking my homies away. Now it's crazy, the ignorance in people, right? And what they really believe, right? Like this delusion, right? That they're sweeping up all these gang bangers, but all these gang bangers are American. They're all American. Maybe if they would have done these sweeps like back in the 50s and 40s or 30s, maybe they could have done a dent, right? But doing them now, all these individuals are citizens. They're multi generations, already in this country. You know, all these individuals are United States citizens. Um, the gangs were created here in America. They didn't come from Mexico. They don't come from Mexico. They start here in America because of the discrimination and because of the problems that we're having, right? These kids growing up see these problems, they feel some type of way, and you get a whole lot of chaos, right? So this doesn't actually help the problem; it actually creates the problem, But like I said, people just talk without knowing or just ignorant. Is there immigrants within these gangs? Yes, of course, right? But out of like 100, maybe only 7 of them don't have papers. Maybe 9, 10, 20 at the most. Out of like 100 at the most, right? Most of these individuals were born here. They're Americans. So no, it's not gonna help. That problem. Now I was seeing people say about the homeless problem and everything like that. Trust me, I reside in these areas, and most of the homeless that I see are not raza. You know what I mean? Sure, you do have some raza in there, right? But a majority of them are not raza. So, as in it denting the homeless problem, like I said, maybe if people just believe whatever they see on the internet that don't actually live in these areas, right? They fall for those type of lies. But someone that actually comes from these areas, I can tell you, well, no, that's not true. None of that is true. You know, um, they're actually taking, they're actually going into businesses and taking individuals, right? Now, most people when they think about the immigration problem, right, or these raids, they don't look at the big picture. They just look at the small picture. The small picture being, get these illegals out of here, right? That's all they care about. Just deport all these illegals out of here, right? Even if they didn't commit a crime or they did commit a crime, they just get them out of here, right? Now, no one's crying and no one's protesting if they're getting rid of criminals, murderers, drug dealers, and none of that. No one cares for those people, right? Why they're upset is because they're going into actual businesses, companies, and taking working people. Now, as much as people say that, the problem is because they don't pay their taxes or, they're getting away with the whole tax thing, they reside in America. Nothing in America is free. They still have to pay rent, they still have to pay bills, they still have to buy groceries, spend money, that gets taxed because they're spending it here in America, right? So they're taking the taxes, right? They're, the money keeps flowing because they have to keep spending and buying more materials. Let's say for those who have their own businesses, have to keep buying more stuff. So the money keeps flowing, money keeps getting spent, money keeps being, generated, keeps getting moved here in America. People still got to pay rent, bills, electricity. That's not free. People don't live for free. So now what happens when you're going into these businesses and actually taking these working individuals and removing them? Because I could understand that they're rolling up to the blocks and tackling these, individuals out here in the streets that are, let's say, illegals that are selling drugs, when the individuals that are most likely selling the drugs are actually American citizens. So it's not actually tackling that problem, right? But like I said, it's a lie that gets repeated and spinned over and over and over again. You know what I mean? But you know, like I said, people just believe the propaganda, the lies that are being told. But when you're actually going into businesses and actually taking the working individuals, right, it's going to affect your economy, and it's already starting to affect the economy. Now, while they're wasting all kinds of money and, in the National Guard and armored vehicles and all of that costs a lot of money, right? Money that really doesn't need to be spent because they really don't need to be moving like that. But, like I said, it's just a flex, right? But it's a waste of money. That's why it's an issue. But people don't look at that problem either, right? Because of their ignorance, right? Because of their political views. Like I said, I'm not liberal, I'm not Democrat, I'm not Republican, I'm not conservative. If I say fuck them all, they're all the same to me. I'm not a fan of Gavin Newsom, I'm not a fan of the Democrats, I'm not a fan of the Republicans. I only call it for how it is. You get what I mean? So people can't use none of that on me. You know what I'm saying? I could only call it for how it is and how I see it. And this, and I actually researched the stuff myself, right? I don't believe whatever the mainstream media says. And this is gonna cost a lot of money, right? And like I said, they choose to make cuts in budgets that make no sense, right? Like the budget cut that they did on Texas, right? For their weather warning systems, right? That could have saved a lot of lives. But since they don't believe in that, right? But right there, they don't speak on that. They don't holler on that. They don't go and protest that, right? But they want to protest this. Like, oh, you see how these people are crying about these federal agents doing their jobs? Hey, how about you speak about the errors that your side be doing? I point out the errors that both sides do. But these individuals that have, bias, and are just one-sided, but then claim that they're actually for the American people and the country, you're full of shit. You're for your political party and that's it. Because if you can only call the bullshit on one side but not on the other side, then you're full of shit. You got to call the bullshit when you see it on both sides. Because it's about it making America great, improving America, and standing for America. Not for Republican, not for Democrat, not for liberals, and not for conservative. This is not about political parties. But overall, that's just my opinion. What are your thoughts? Leave it in the comments. Shout out. We out.